The dunes north of Overveen are quiet in April. Sandgrass, a cold wind off the North Sea, and just beyond the tree line, the sound of the surf you can hear but not see. It's the 17th of April, 1945. The war in Europe has 3 weeks left to run, though nobody's standing in that sand knows it yet. A young woman walks between two armed men. She's 24 years old. Her hair, which used to be a deep, unmistakable red, is dyed black and cut short, but the roots are already growing back in, and that's the thing that got her caught. She's been beaten, interrogated, and held in a cell for almost a month, and she still hasn't given up a single name. One of the men raises his pistol. The first shot only grazes her. She turns to him, calm, and says something that will outlive every person standing in those dunes. I shoot better than you. The second shot doesn't miss. Her name is Yanetya Johanna Schaft. The Nazis call her the girl with the red hair, because for 2 years, that's all they had. A description, a rumor, a woman on a bicycle who kept appearing at the edge of dead German officers. Her friends called her Hanny. And 3 weeks before liberation, with the war already lost and both sides quietly agreeing to stop the killing, somebody decided she was worth one more bullet. This is her story, and the story of the two sisters who taught her how to fire a gun. To understand what happened in those dunes, you have to go back 5 years, to a city that looks nothing like a battlefield. Haarlem sits a short bike ride west of Amsterdam, a city of church spires and canal bridges and cobblestone streets that had survived centuries without much trouble. In May of 1940, that changed in 5 days. German paratroopers dropped out of the sky over Dutch airfields. The Luftwaffe flattened the center of Rotterdam to break the country's will, and the Netherlands, a small, neutral nation that had sat out the First World War entirely, surrendered before the invasion was a week old. For most Dutch families, occupation arrived slowly. German soldiers in the streets, curfews, ration books, and then, gradually, the disappearance of neighbors. For the Oversteeken family, it arrived on top of politics they'd been living for years already. Truus and Freddie Oversteken's mother was a committed communist who'd already taken in Jewish refugees and political fugitives before the invasion. She raised her daughters, Truus, born in 1923, and Freddie, born in 1925, in the nearby village of Schoten, in a house where hiding people from the government wasn't an abstract principle. It was just what you did on a Tuesday. By the time the occupation began in earnest, the Oversteegen home was already sheltering a Jewish couple in a back room, which meant Truus and Freddie grew up understanding, before most of their classmates did, exactly what a knock on the door at the wrong hour could mean. Freddie was 14 when the Germans crossed the border. Truus was 17. Neither of them was old enough to vote, drive, or serve in any army, but they were old enough to notice what was happening to the Jewish families on their street, and old enough to be furious about it. They started small, the way almost every resistance movement in occupied Europe started small. Their mother had them stapling and folding illegal newspapers at the kitchen table, then riding their bicycles across Haarlem at night to drop stacks of anti-Nazi pamphlets in mailboxes and doorways. It was dangerous. Printing or distributing this material could get you shot, but to two teenage girls, it probably felt more like a secret than a war. That changed the day a stranger showed up at their door. His name was Frans van der Wiel, and he ran the Haarlem Council of Resistance, one of the armed cells feeding into the broader Dutch underground. He'd heard about the sisters through the pamphlet network, and he came to the house with their mother's blessing to see what the girls were made of. What he did next has become one of the most retold moments of the story, because it says everything about what the war demanded of children. Van der Wiel pretended to be a Gestapo agent. He pulled a gun on Truus and Freddie right there in their own home and demanded they give up the address of a Jewish man they knew. It was a test, though the girls didn't know that in the moment. As far as they understood, a stranger with a pistol had just threatened to kill them over information that would get someone else killed too. They didn't give him the address. Freddie, 14 years old, went at the man with her hands. Vanderveel lowered the gun, apparently satisfied, and told them what he actually wanted: for the sisters to join the Council of Resistance for real. Their mother gave her permission, and only after they'd agreed did he explain what the job would actually involve: sabotaging bridges and railway lines, running weapons and messages past checkpoints, and when it came to it, learning how to kill. Freddie was the youngest active member of the Harlem Resistance. She was handed a rifle before most girls her age had been handed a driver's permit. What followed was a strange, unglamorous education. Vanderveel and his other resistance leaders took the sisters into the dunes and the surrounding woods outside Harlem to teach them to shoot, to strip and clean a weapon in the dark, to move without making noise on wet sand, and to lie convincingly with a straight face if a soldier stopped them and asked what was in the basket. There was nothing romantic about it. It was closer to an apprenticeship in violence, taught by adults who understood something the occupiers hadn't figured out yet: that these girls' baby faces and school uniforms were about to become their greatest tactical asset. German soldiers manning checkpoints searched suspicious-looking men. They searched briefcases, coat linings, the false bottoms of delivery carts. They rarely searched teenage girls on bicycles, even when those bicycles had pistols hidden under a blanket, or a loaf of bread, or a bundle of laundry in the front basket. Freddie would ride straight past a checkpoint with a rifle a few inches from a German soldier's hand, pedaling at exactly the unhurried pace of a girl running an errand for her mother, because that's precisely what she looked like she was doing. That blind spot in German suspicion is the whole reason the story is possible. And it's also the reason two teenage sisters were about to become saboteurs, couriers, and eventually assassins for the Dutch underground. Around this time, in a Harlem hospital, the sisters met a young woman who would become inseparable from their story. Someone whose name, decades later, would end up on more war memorials in the Netherlands than almost any other resistance fighter, man or woman. Janetje Johanna Schaft had grown up as an only child in every way that mattered, though she wasn't born one. Her older sister Annie died of diphtheria when Hanny was 7, and after that loss, her parents, a school teacher father with socialist convictions and a devoutly Christian socialist mother, became fiercely protective of the daughter they had left. Hanny grew up into a shy, bookish young woman with a sharp mind and even sharper convictions. In the fall of 1938, she started studying law at the University of Amsterdam, drawn to the idea of becoming a human rights lawyer in a Europe that was rapidly making human rights a joke. She was, by every account, more radical than her parents. She believed the kind of injustice she saw around her couldn't be fixed by law alone, that it would take something closer to revolution. When the Germans occupied the Netherlands and began requiring Dutch civil servants and students to sign a declaration of loyalty, a document that also functioned as a quiet purge of Jewish students and staff, Hanny refused to sign. She had to abandon her law degree rather than put her name on that paper. She moved back to Harlem, and it was there, through the same underground pamphlet network, that she crossed paths with Truus and Freddie Oversteken. They were an odd trio on paper. Truus was blunt, physical, and instinctive, the one who made decisions fast and lived with the consequences. Freddie was the youngest, watchful and precise, often the one scouting a target or mapping an escape route before anyone else moved. Hanny was the intellectual of the group, the law student turned fugitive who thought several steps ahead and, thanks to her studies, could talk her way past interrogators who underestimated her. And she had one physical trait that made her both an asset and a liability: bright red hair that made her instantly recognizable and impossible to hide for long. They became friends first. The war made them something closer to family. What the three of them actually did for the resistance over the next 3 years defies the tidy categories we usually put wartime heroism into. They weren't soldiers in uniforms fighting on a front line. They were teenagers and a law student running errands that could get them shot on sight if a document was found in the wrong bicycle basket. Some of the work was quiet and grinding, acting as couriers, moving coded messages and stolen ration cards between resistance cells that couldn't risk direct contact with each other. Some of it involved finding safe houses for Jewish children whose parents had already been deported, walking kids across the city under the pretense of an afternoon outing, knowing that a wrong look from a soldier could end everything. Some of it was sabotage in the most literal sense, using dynamite supplied by the underground to disable railway lines and bridges the Germans depended on to move troops and supplies. And some of it, the part that made them infamous, and the part most people know them for today, was killing. The three women, sometimes working together and sometimes in pairs, were tasked with assassinating German soldiers, Dutch Nazi collaborators, and informants who had been feeding the occupiers information that got resistance members and Jewish families captured. Their methods varied. Sometimes it meant identifying a target and simply shooting him in the street or ambushing him on a quiet road. Sometimes, and this is the detail that's followed Truce and Freddy through every retelling since, it meant flirting with a German officer in a bar or at a dance, letting him believe he was being seduced, and walking him into the woods on the pretense of a romantic evening. He would leave with a young woman on his arm and never come out the other side. One operation from the final stretch of the war gives a clearer picture of how this actually worked on the ground than any general description can. On the 1st of March 1945, Truce and Hanny tracked down a Dutch police officer named Wilhelm Zirkzee and shot him near the Kriegel House on the Lietzeweert, one of Haarlem's canal-side streets. 2 weeks later, on the 15th of March, they went after a Sicherheitsdienst operative named Ko Langendijk. That one didn't go as cleanly. Langendijk survived his wounds, recovered, and lived long enough to testify years later at the trial of his own girlfriend, a Dutch woman convicted of collaboration. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison himself, but not before the operation reminded Truce and Hanny, in the most direct way possible, that this work didn't always end the way it was planned, and that surviving a hit didn't make a man any less dangerous to the woman who'd carried it out. By this stage of the war, the division of labor inside their small cell had settled into something close to routine, if anything about it could be called routine. Freddy was most often the one doing reconnaissance, watching a target's movements for days, learning his schedule, figuring out which street he walked down and when, before ever raising a weapon herself. Truce and Hanny were the ones who, most often than not, pulled the trigger. It wasn't a formal division so much as one that emerged from who was good at what, which is its own quiet, unsettling detail. That three young women had sorted themselves, by trial and error, into an efficient killing team, the way other people might sort themselves into who cooks and who does the dishes. It's worth pausing on how strange and how heavy that must have been to carry, even setting aside the killing itself. These were teenagers being asked to perform charm and attraction towards men whose uniforms represented everything they hated. Men who in some cases had almost certainly participated in the deportation of Jewish neighbors these same girls had tried to protect. There's no glamour in the operational reality of it, whatever the phrase seducing Nazis might suggest in a headline. It was cold, deliberate, and it left scars that outlasted the war by decades. Freddy later described the position bluntly, when asked years afterward how a teenage girl processed doing this kind of thing at all. You didn't get time to think about it in the moment. You did the job, and you dealt with what it did to you much, much later, if you ever really dealt with it at all. By 1944, the German occupation of the Netherlands had turned desperate and vicious in equal measure. The Allies had landed in Normandy in June. By September, Dutch railway workers had gone on strike to help the Allied advance, and the German response was a punishing food blockade across the western Netherlands. Coal shipments stopped, food shipments stopped. That winter, city dwellers in Amsterdam and Haarlem were boiling tulip bulbs for something to put in their stomachs, tearing up floorboards for fuel, and walking for days into the countryside to trade wedding rings and jewelry for a few potatoes. By the time it was over, close to 20,000 Dutch civilians had starved to death in a famine that came to be known simply as the Hunger Winter. It happened in the same towns and along the same roads where Truus, Freddie, and Hanny were still moving weapons and messages, which meant every mission that winter was run by young women who were themselves cold, hungry, and running out of margin for error. The occupiers knew they were losing, and losing armies with nothing left to lose tend to get more brutal, not less. For the resistance, this meant the stakes on every operation climbed. German security services, the SD and the Grünze had been hunting the girl with the red hair for close to 2 years by this point, aware that a young woman matching Hanny's description had been connected to a string of assassinations across the Haarlem region. She'd become one of the most wanted resistance fighters in the country, known by description if not by name, which meant her hair, her most striking feature, had become a death sentence waiting to be recognized. She started dyeing it dark and cutting it short, wearing glasses she didn't need, changing her name on false papers as often as she changed safe houses. Truus and Freddie kept working too, moving weapons, running sabotage missions, staying one step ahead of a security apparatus that was getting more paranoid and more lethal by the week as Allied forces pushed towards the Dutch border. Every one of those three had opportunities to walk away. None of them took them. On the 21st of March 1945, Hanny Schaft was stopped at a German checkpoint in Haarlem. She was carrying copies of an illegal communist newspaper, which was itself enough to arrest her, but which also served, deliberately or not, as a story that hid the fact she was actually transporting sensitive documentation for the resistance. The soldiers searching bicycles that day weren't looking for a specific woman. They were doing routine security work in a city crawling with underground activity in the final stretch of the war. She might have talked her way out of it. She'd done it before, but this time something didn't hold, and she was taken into custody and transferred to a prison in Amsterdam. What followed was weeks of interrogation. The Germans by this point had a physical description of the woman they believed was responsible for a string of assassinations across North Holland, but no photograph, no fingerprints, nothing that tied this particular prisoner, dark-haired, wearing glasses, giving a false name, to the person they were looking for. She held out through the questioning. She held out through, by multiple accounts, torture. And then someone made a mistake that had nothing to do with courage or interrogation technique at all. Her hair started growing back in at the roots, and the color coming through wasn't dark. A former colleague of hers, a woman named Anna Vinchoff, who had turned collaborator, was brought in and identified her by that detail alone. The girl with the red hair had finally been found, sitting quietly in a cell with black dye growing out. It's a strange thing to sit with, that after everything the security services had thrown at finding her, after 2 years of failed sweeps and dead-end tips across the whole Haarlem region, the thing that finally gave Hanny Schaft away wasn't a mistake in tradecraft or a slip in an interrogation room. It was hair growing the way hair grows, an inch a month, whether you want it to or not. She'd outthought and outlasted trained interrogators for weeks. She couldn't out-argue her own scalp. By April of 1945, everyone in the Netherlands, occupier and occupied alike, understood the war was ending. Canadian and other Allied forces had already liberated the southern provinces months earlier. The northern and western Netherlands, including Haarlem and Amsterdam, remained under German control, but only barely, and for only a matter of weeks. There had even been informal understandings reached in some areas between the retreating German command and Dutch resistance authorities to stop executions, given how close the end clearly was. Hanny Schaaf didn't benefit from any of that restraint. On the 17th of April 1945, with the German surrender in the Netherlands roughly 3 weeks away, with Allied forces already crossing into German territory on multiple fronts, with the war for all practical purposes already decided, she was taken from her cell to the dunes near Overveen, close to Bloemendaal, and executed. The details of that final walk have been retold often enough that some of them have taken on the texture of legend, but the core of it holds up across the accounts. A first shot that failed to kill her outright, her steady reply to the men holding the guns, and a second shot that finished what the first one didn't. She was 24 years old. She was buried where she fell, in the dunes, in an unmarked grave alongside other resistance victims executed in the same stretch of coastline. 3 weeks later, the Netherlands was free. Liberation didn't erase what had happened in those dunes. If anything, it made the loss sharper. Because Hanny hadn't just died in the war, she died at the very end of it, close enough to see the finish line from where she was standing. That November, her remains were exhumed along with others buried near Overveen, and Hanny Shaft became the first person reinterred at the newly established Cemetery of Honor in Bloemendaal, a national resting place created specifically for resistance fighters and war dead. Members of the Dutch royal family attended. It's hard to overstate what that distinction meant in a country working out in real time who its wartime heroes actually were and how it wanted to remember them. Of all the resistance fighters the Netherlands lost, she was the first laid to rest in the ground built to honor them. And in the decades since, no other individual resistance fighter, man or woman, has come to represent the Dutch underground in the national imagination quite the way she has. Streets, schools, and the National Women's Peace Prize carry her name today. Truus and Freddie survived to see the liberation Hanny missed by 3 weeks. Surviving turned out to be its own complicated inheritance. War doesn't end cleanly for the people who fought it in the shadows, and it didn't end cleanly for either sister. Freddie, still a teenager when the occupation ended, found herself sidelined in the post-war years, partly because she'd been part of a communist-aligned resistance youth group, and the Dutch government of the Cold War era had little patience for communists, however heroically they'd behaved a few years earlier. For decades, her wartime record went largely unacknowledged outside the small circle of people who'd lived it with her. When asked, much later in life, how she'd made peace with the killings she'd done as a teenager, she gave an answer that was almost startling in its plainness. She got married, and she had children. That was how she moved forward, not through therapy or public reckoning, both of which barely existed for people like her in the 1940s and 50s, but through an ordinary, deliberate business of building a life that looked nothing like the one she had at 14 with a rifle in a bicycle basket. Truus processed the war differently. She turned toward art. In the 1950s, she enrolled at the Haarlem Art Academy and studied under a sculptor who'd been part of the resistance himself. She spent much of the rest of her life making paintings and sculptures shaped by what she'd lived through, work that toured well beyond the Netherlands. One piece, a bronze figure called Woman in the Resistance, stands in Haarlem in memory of the friend she'd lost in those dunes. Another of her sculptures was erected at Camp Westerbroek, the transit camp from which so many Dutch Jewish families had been deported to their deaths. The very people she and her sister and Hanny had spent years trying, in whatever small ways they could, to protect. She also wrote a memoir and spent years afterward giving talks about what she'd seen and done, refusing to let the story soften into something comfortable. For decades, though, the wider Dutch public knew relatively little about either sister. Their story only reached a broad audience in 2016 when a Dutch television documentary profiled them together for the first time as elderly women looking back on the war they'd fought as children. It was around that same period, 2014, 2 years before that documentary aired, that Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte awarded both sisters the Mobilization War Cross, a formal state recognition that had taken 7 decades to arrive. Truus died in 2016, the same year that documentary brought her and her sister's story to a wider audience than they'd ever had while the story was still theirs to tell in real time. Freddie died 2 years later, in 2018, at 92 years old. The last of the three friends who'd once ridden bicycles across the city with guns hidden under their blankets, so many decades removed from that girl that it must have felt, some days, like remembering someone else's life entirely. What stands out, looking back across both of their long lives, isn't just what they did between 1940 and 1945. It's how ordinary they insisted on making everything that came after. Freddie raised a family and rarely spoke about the war to anyone outside it. Truce turned her grief into bronze and paint and kept giving talks to school groups well into her 80s because she believed, as she put it more than once, that the only real insurance against this happening again was making sure young people actually understood what it had cost the last time. Neither of them ever described themselves as heroes in the way the word gets used in headlines. They described themselves more often as girls who'd been asked to do something and had said yes, and then spent the rest of their lives figuring out what that yes was going to mean. There's a photograph of the three of them from around the time all of this happened. Three young women, unremarkable in the way anyone looks unremarkable in a group photo. Nothing in their faces to suggest what they'd already done or what more they were about to do. That's the detail that tends to stay with people longer than the dunes, longer than the checkpoint, longer even than the last thing Hannie Schaft ever said. Not that they were fearless, not that they were extraordinary in some obvious way you could point to on the street. Just that they were girls, 16, 18, 24, who decided one afternoon in an occupied city that they weren't going to sit still for what was happening to their neighbors, and they spent years finding out exactly what that decision would cost them. Hannie Schaft never got to grow old with that photograph. Truce and Freddie did, and they spent the rest of their lives learning how to carry a war that ended for their country in May of 1945, but never entirely ended for them. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what you want to see next. And I'll see you on the next one.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?